Drasha Shalom. So in our Parsha, right, we read about the completion of the construction of the tabernacle. And as I mentioned in my introduction to the Parsha last week, many commentators believe that God instituted the tabernacle in response to the golden calf, right? That the people needed some concrete expression of devotion and spirituality. They needed something concrete, not something, formless. And so in that understanding, the tabernacle is not really for God, it's for us, right? And I would say that's actually pretty much true of all the mitzvahs, right? I mean, God doesn't have needs, right? God doesn't have needs, right? We have needs. So the things that we do may come from God, but God gave them to us to fulfill our religious aspirations. Okay, so in the Haftarah that Stu read so beautifully, we have the completion of the temple, right? And supposedly that's now it, right? That's where the worship, that's where the sacrifices should take place. But we know from the various prophetic books, including the Haftarah that we read for Shabbat Shekalim, that even after the dedication of the temple, the local Bamot had not been, the local shrines had not been done away with. All right, we read that, right? It says, Yoash, right, the king in last week's Haftarah, did what was right in the sight of the Lord, Rak HaBamot lo sar, except for the fact that the Bamot had not been done away. Okay, now why do we have this conflict, right, between these two paradigms of worship, right? The local shrine with the local Kohen that people could go and worship and bring their sacrifices, or a centralized sanctuary in Jerusalem, right? And the book of Deuteronomy, all right, and this is, by the way, when we talk about evidence that the Torah was written by different people at different times, right? Deuteronomy overwhelmingly, constantly emphasizes the fact or its perspective that everybody has to come to Jerusalem for the Hagim, and sacrifices can only be offered at the temple in Jerusalem. Okay, and because this wasn't instituted until much later by David and Solomon, right, and then not really firmly established as the norm until much later than that, that will be evidence that Deuteronomy was written later, okay, and not by Moses. Because in the other books of the Torah, there doesn't seem to be that concern that sacrifices can only be in Jerusalem, right? And I have what I call a hermeneutical principle, right? In other words, a way to interpret certain writings, right? If a writing is constantly saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, do that instead, what does it tell you? That the people were doing the thing that the writer said they shouldn't do, right? I mean, right? Nobody bothers to tell somebody not to do something unless they're already doing it, right? Or unless you have a reason to believe that they might, right? So we have this binary, if you will, between the central shrine and the central sanctuary, the local shrine, right? What is the advantage of the central shrine? Maintains the unity of the people, and beyond that, right, the person in charge can make sure that you're doing things right. Right? I mean, go, right, especially, I mean, go to any shul in the world, right? Go to 2 shuls in the world, and I guarantee you that there are some things that the 2 shuls will do differently from each other, right? I mean, it could be something major, it could be something minor, right? But for people who think that there's only one way to do something, right? That situation can drive you nuts, right? So you want a central shrine, right? But if you live, in the Galilee somewhere, or you live in Beersheba, right? Every time you want to worship, you got to schlep to Jerusalem, right? Moreover, originally, since meat could only be eaten from a sacrifice, anytime you feel like eating meat, you got to schlep to Jerusalem, right? That's not practical, right? So the desire of the people to have accessible local worship is entirely understandable, right? And the Bamot were eventually eliminated, right? But they were replaced by the synagogue, right? The synagogue, most people think the synagogue developed because the temple was destroyed, right? No, the synagogue developed actually in Babylonia during the Babylonian exile, and that paradigm came back to Israel, and during the period of the Second Temple, you simultaneously had the temple and you had local synagogues, right? I mean, you want evidence of that, right? Because I've often said, if you want to know what Jewish life was like towards the end of the Second Temple period, read the Gospels, right? And Jesus went and he read the Torah in the synagogue in Capernaum, right? This was while the temple still stood, right? So we know that they had synagogues and they had Torah readings while the Second Temple existed, right? And the Mishnah tells us there was even a synagogue on the Temple Mount, right? But it's the destruction of the temple which made the synagogue the definitive worship paradigm, right? And paradigm changes are always scary, right? I mean, I mentioned, Professor Fishbane mentioned in his commentary on the Haftarah that the tabernacle and the temple represent 2 different modes, right? Religion as a journey versus religion as something fixed and stable, right? And I do think, like, different people view the role of religion differently. I mean, even here, I mean, some people, journey change is inevitable. Some people know things must stay the same. The world is changing too rapidly. I want someplace that stays the same, right? And I read an article many years ago that always stayed with me. It was in a journal for congregations, not specifically Jewish congregations. And the title of the article is Why Incremental Change Doesn't Work. Okay, and I'll give an example, okay? And this is not advocacy of anything, right? But let's assume that there was sufficient agitation to include the matriarchs in the Amida, right? So, and we talked about it, the ritual committee and the board, okay, we have to make the change, but let's do it gradually, okay, so that people won't get so upset, right? So we'll have the matriarchs once a month, okay, and then after a while, it'll be twice a month, right? And then after a while of doing that, it'll be 3 times a month. And finally, we'll do it every Shabbos. Okay? That is the biggest mistake you can make. Okay? Because here is a truism. People do not like change. Okay? They don't like small changes. They don't like big changes. And they especially don't like changes in their house of worship. Right? I mean, you know, the complaints that I get about things that would be like nourishment, right? Oh, you changed, that's not the way we do it, what, you know, and I understand it, okay? I mean, part of me says, okay, don't be absurd, but part of me says, I understand, right? Because everything around us is changing all the time, right? I mean, right, think of it. You cannot live without a smartphone, right? And a person who doesn't have a smartphone is considered weird, right? How many of you had a smartphone 12 years ago? Right? You would, all right. Some of you did, but many of you did not, right? And today you can't live without it, right? I mean, you sometimes literally can't live without it because if you're going to an event, the only way that you get a ticket is on your smartphone, right? You can't log into your bank account. You know, your bank will send you a code that you have to put into your right to show that it's really you, right? Everything is changing. Everything is changing all the time. I want one thing that doesn't change. I want one thing that stays the same. That's my shoe, right? And now, instead of introducing one change one time, right, you've introduced 4 changes, right? Change from never matriarchs to once a month. And then a change from once a month to twice, et cetera, right? So instead of doing it one time, you have 4 changes for people to be upset about. Okay? If you're going to make the change, and again, I am not advocating one way or another. Okay? It's just the first sort of example of something that synagogues commonly go through, right? So the example that popped into my mind, right? If you're going to do it, right? Rip off the Band-Aid, right? If you don't do 4 small changes. Because people don't like small change, they don't like big change, right? And it doesn't matter if it's a good change or a bad change, people don't like it. Oh, you change the temperature on the thermometer. Okay, oh, you change the place where the owl is, right? Oh, whatever it is, people, right? And change is difficult, right? But the fact of the matter is that change is inevitable, right? Change is inevitable because society changes, right? I mean, I thought quite some time ago that we ought to offer video access to our services for people who can't come in person, right? I'm going to say something very bizarre sounding. Thank God for the pandemic, right? Because the pandemic made that decision inevitable, right? If not for the pandemic, we would have had 10 meetings and surveys and plebiscites and fights and arguments and people not talking to each other over whether we should offer video access to our services or not, right? So change is inevitable and there's nothing that you can do about it. I mean, and you know, we see now a younger generation that are not joiners. They're not joiners, right? They want to participate in stuff, But they're right, and those of you who have kids in their 20s or 30s know that I didn't just learn this from like reading something in the newspaper, right? They're just not joiners, right? And as you see, right? More people are bowling than ever, right? Bowling leagues are dead, right? People don't join. So we have to, and when I say we, I don't mean just Kehilat Shalom. I mean every synagogue in the country, right, has to figure out how to adjust your paradigm to attract younger people, right? Particularly younger people who are not schlepped here by their parents, right? And it's hard, right? Because what we have now works for us and we like it, right? If we didn't like it, we wouldn't be here, right? So asking a bunch of people who like what we have to come up with something different that they probably won't like as much, right, is very difficult, right? But we are moving, aside from the fact how, and again, I don't know about your kids, right? But the younger generation doesn't have the automatic attachment and support for Israel that we do, right? And, it can make you upset, but it's a fact, and you can't just wish it away, right? And it's sometimes hard to understand, but again, we know that it's true, right? So, there are challenges of the American Jewish community that we can just ignore, or we can figure out how to deal with, right? And just as, our people embrace the reality that the temple is destroyed, the synagogue is what there is, we have to embrace certain realities of how the world is changing, even if there are changes we don't like, and even if there are changes that make us deeply uncomfortable. Shabbat Shalom. And we continue with the Kaddish before Musaf and the Musaf service.